First, I would like to thank you all for having me here, particularly Sharik. It's a real honor to be part of this group and to, in particular, speak on a panel with Barbara Ibrahim. I showed up in Cairo in 2010 with about 5 words of Arabic and a crazy, at the time, conviction that Arab philanthropy was worth studying. And I didn't have so much support for that conviction back here, but Barbara and her team really embraced me and helped me to build a research project, so it's quite an honor. I'd like to talk about 3 themes that I saw as I read through the papers. First, the institutionalization of philanthropy in Muslim-majority countries and questions of institutional isomorphism. Second, government and civil society organization relations. And third, determinants of giving. I'll start with the institutionalization of philanthropy and questions of isomorphism. In the paper on networks, I read about the mushrooming of voluntary organizations, and this is true throughout the Muslim-majority region. And we're seeing, along with this mushrooming of organizations, of NGOs, of philanthropic foundations, of networks, both adoption of institutional forms that are common in the West, and also adaptation to fit cultural, political, and economic realities. This raises questions of who is stimulating this mushrooming of organizations? Is it the state? As states increasingly privatize their economies and look to non-governmental organizations and philanthropists to fund those organizations, what is the role of the state? What is the role of donors, be they local donors or international donors? What is the role of the founders of these organizations? What is the role of networks? And of course, what is the role of universities? What types of forms are adopted and adapted? Again, I'd like to quote the paper on networks. We're seeing the rise of modern Islamic organizations meeting with old traditions of charity. The Risala example, the founder's motivation originated from a personal experience. While in Canada, he was fascinated with the civic engagement there and the strong presence of social responsibility among individuals, a trait that he found lacking in Egyptian society, especially among young people. Ultimately, one of the results of this was the establishment of Risala. We're seeing also the rise of philanthropic foundations in Egypt, in Palestine, community foundations in particular, that are, on the one hand, adopting, in some ways, the structures and values of community foundations that originated in the West, but also adapting them to fit. In Egypt, the community foundation trying to bring back the concept of waqf, while at the same time using some of the language and structure of Western community foundations. In Palestine, an attempt to bring back al-una, which is informal aid and assistance, but through the structure of a community foundation. So we're seeing traditions of zakat, of waqf, of al-una being revived, but often within the context of organizational forms that often very much resemble organizational forms such as the NGO, the philanthropic foundation, with which we're familiar in the West. So questions of adoption and adaptation, and what does this mean for both the structure and the roles of organizations that we're seeing. Government and civil society relations. This brings up questions of regulation, of independence, of trust, and the roles of civil society organizations. In 2 of the papers, we saw a real tension between cooperation and contestation between civil society organizations and the state. In many cases, as I mentioned earlier, we've seen states encourage the proliferation of civil society organizations, but then move to co-opt or control those organizations, or harass those organizations, and to use harassment and regulations as tools of control. Both, again, the network paper and the Resala paper pick up on this. In the paper on networks, an Indonesia law that non-state zakat organizations should help zakat, state zakat bodies actually led to the formation of, or the transformation, if I understood correctly, of some of these zakat organizations into humanitarian foundations. So as the state moved to exert control over zakat, we saw the emergence of new forms of organizations that could act independently of the state. We saw the same in Egypt as the governments of Nasser and Sadat nationalized the Waqf. Ultimately, we saw the rise of private philanthropic foundations because the Waqf was seen really as falling under the purview of the government. So the rise of different types of organizations that could somehow be independent from the state. Resala highlights how organizations struggle to survive in the face of government repression and harassment and control. Also, with a trend toward activism, informal networks, and increased activism among populations, what does this mean for traditional NGOs? And the extent to which individuals who are interested in promoting change look to the NGO form, the philanthropic, or the philanthropic foundation form, as vehicles through which to achieve change, or are they more looking to networks, less formal networks, social enterprises, for example, that can, again, move outside of some state control of NGO sectors. I urge the authors to look to the literature on government-NGO relations, particularly that which focuses on semi-autocratic states, where we understand that states do promote civil society organizations, but use a variety of mechanisms to co-opt and control those organizations. The Resala paper makes a wonderful contribution here, because much of the existing literature develops frameworks that are rather static. And your paper gets into the micro-level details of how organizations adapt when faced with adaptation by a political regime. There's a real contribution here. We're starting to see some of this more micro-level analysis coming out of China and Egypt, and I think this is a wonderful contribution here. Finally, determinants of giving. Relationship between education, trust, and giving, I would like to start with. You really focus in the Turkey paper on this, this relationship. And education really, well, two issues really stood out. The question of institutional trust, which I think is a big issue. At least I've certainly seen this in the Egyptian context. But I suspect more generally, there's a long history of giving at individual levels or to a religious organization. But when we get to the institutional level, giving to NGOs, at least what I've experienced is that there's a larger level of distrust of organized, institutionalized philanthropy. On the other hand, though, we are seeing the rise throughout at least the Arab region, with which I'm familiar, of programs within universities that promote civic engagement and philanthropy. Barbara's Center, the Gerhardt Center for Philanthropy and Civic Engagement at the American University of Cairo is one. Al-Najah University in Palestine has a similar center. And so and of course, you mentioned the role of a Canadian university. And so we really are seeing an increased focus within education systems on philanthropy and civic engagement. So I wonder if there's anything at play here. And the question of age really intrigued me. I wonder if part of the reason we're not seeing age as a determining factor is that somehow the younger generation has caught up. I have no idea. There's no grounding in this idea other than that we're seeing the globalization of the popularity of philanthropy, and these university-based education centers are young people somehow more exposed today than young people were among the generation of current 65-year-olds. So I wonder if, as we study this over time, if age might come into play again. Education was certainly key in the Risala example. Galvanized by their lecturers' discussions on social responsibility, volunteering, and public service, a group of students took the initiative and decided to start an on-campus club. So we really do see a role for education across these papers. David, you mentioned that recognition of giving is often a stimulant to give. Whereas I wonder if this is similar in Muslim-majority countries where giving has traditionally been done quietly, anonymously, and only in the eyes of God. So this is, I think, another area where culture may really play a role, along with gender, perhaps. I was also wondering if questions of education and socioeconomic status might affect the gender variable at all. Just a small question. So I mentioned, yes, and this question of institutional trust. To what extent or is trust in formal institutionalized philanthropy changing? So to summarize, 3 main themes from the papers: isomorphism, questions of the adoption and adaptation of philanthropic organizational forms based on cultural traditions, current needs, and politics and governing regimes. Government and civil society organization relations, the effects on organization structure and roles. And third, the determinants of giving, the importance particularly of education and institutional trust, and also the practical implications thereof. Thank you.
So Dr. Herrold has put a lot of observations and questions before the panel, but I'm actually going to give you all the opportunity to put some more questions in front of them before asking them to respond, since you've been a very patient audience, and we have about 15 minutes to go. So I will see if there are questions out there, and if there are, great. Are we just speaking loudly, or you're going to circulate? Great.
Thank you so much. I praise all presenters, but I have a particular interest on the paper or the work by David and Ali, because it's very similar to the research I'm doing now on testing the influence of individual donations in a dominated Muslim country. So I have some questions. The one when you make the comparison between the 2004-2015, did you take into account the regional crisis and how it is affect the giving behavior? I mean, the Syrian crisis has a big effect on the Turkish community or the Turkish as a country. As far as I know, because I'm a practitioner, I work in for organizations, and we have a lot of work done through Turkey, through Turkish organization. Actually, the income tripled 4 times or 5 times when you compare to 2004. So these donations coming from abroad, and maybe this is a factor that affect the giving behavior inside Turkey. This is a question. I have just only one comment what Rahma talk about. about the Risala organization. Actually, this is an example of a common in an undemocratic environment we are facing as in Muslim countries. We'll see one of the main actually challenging a non-profit organization in Muslim world is how to keep your independency, how to be a neutral. Neutrality, unfortunately, I see Risala has changed its behavior from the period of, let's say, from Mubarak to Morsi, then Al-Sisi era. This is a very common problem and challenge facing these organizations. But my main question is to David and Ali. Thank you.
I mean, between 2004 and 2015, many things have happened. This is not a panel study where we actually talk to the same individuals in 2004 and then interviewed the same individuals in 2015. That would have been fantastic, but we simply couldn't do it. So these are samples that are independent of one another. The reflection of Syrian crisis upon giving behavior is only an indirect one, and I think we see it in the way people make donations to street beggars, which actually is, I think, I don't have the figures here, but I think it was at a comparable level to the total donations made in the form of fitre and zakat, for instance. So is the donation, or are the donations to the street beggars religiously motivated, or are they solely or predominantly targeting the Syrian refugees, which you see in the streets of Istanbul, everywhere, in Gaziantep and in many other provinces? That is a very difficult question to ask. I mean, it's a very demanding question. I mean, do you know the origin of the person to whom you actually made the donation? That's, I mean, almost an unknown question. However, the fact that only the donations made to the street beggars have increased compared to all other type of donations at a time when Syrian refugees were approximately 3 million people, okay, mostly in the largest metropolitan areas, suggests to us that, you know, there could be that causal link behind this observation. However, it is an indirect observation. So I don't think I can publish this anywhere, basically. So, do you want to add something?
So I just wanted to pick up a thread, and it involves a couple of observations I just would like to get some quick reactions to in terms of whether you think they have any, excuse me, validity, and then a question that's kind of programmatic, actually, for the study of philanthropy in Muslim majority societies. So before I make my comment, I just wanted to ask Barbara, Gerhardt got the cold shoulder because of the code Muslim word. In what specific national context? I heard Turkey. I thought I heard Egypt. Is there another one?
No, well, those were the two countries where we approached multiple
Gotcha.
universities.
Okay, gotcha. So it seems that kind of coming full circle back to Amy's important discourse on the politics of philanthropy, that the thread I wanted to tease out, and which I think Katie's already done to a certain degree, is it seems to me that the degree to which non-state philanthropic organizations are critical mechanisms for the development of civil society and insulating civil society from governmental power and caprice, civic philanthropy poses a political threat, especially to competitive authoritarian, illiberal democratic, hybrid, semi-autocratic, pick your adjective, governments, right? So if we look out at the three national contexts that I heard, right, Indonesia, which, and I can be wrong on so many fronts, this is just kind of impressionistic, right, from a non-expert. I would consider it to be perhaps the most democratic of the three, Indonesia, Turkey, Egypt. No insult or offense, it's just kind of an observation. The war dissipates. The war you mentioned, Amelia, dissipates abroad. That's an interesting datum, right? Because abroad, there's no more issue of the threat to the existing regime. Turkey, which I would consider now to be in negative transition as one of these hybrid regimes, is actually taking the war abroad. When you consider the role that the Hizmet movement, now FETÖ, the Fethullah terrorist organization, according to the Turkish government, has played in building civil society, including media, Samanyolu television, universities, Fatih University, other universities, elementary schools, high schools, the whole 9 yards. You know, kind of introducing a whole new wrinkle to Turkish philanthropy when Gülen would say things like, you know, we don't need more mosques, we got plenty of them, we need schools. You know, kind of new, I think, sort of on the Turkish landscape. And then Egypt, which I would consider the least democratic now, with one common thread that I think helps maybe, Barbara, explain your experience, which is that in both the Egyptian context and the Turkish context, so-called Islamist groups, you know, or Tajdid and Islah, renewal and reform movements, the Ikhwan in Egypt, and certain Jamaatlar in Turkey, like the Hizmet movement, right, were very instrumental and influential in building the infrastructure of civil society, which then helped democratize, but then that democracy becomes a threat to the semi-autocratic or, you know, hybrid regime. That's the observation I'd like to get some response to. The question is, to what degree do we need to be sure in what we do in the journal, the Center for Muslim Philanthropy, not to lose this thread, and how do we call attention to it and investigate it without playing into larger Islamophobic discourses in the West? Because this is just the kind of thing that Islamophobic discourses want to pick up on and take and run with in an entirely different direction.
I think that's a really interesting observation, one that hadn't really presented itself to me quite as you've stated it. And here's what I think those who are concerned about the civil society support see. That it's never support for civil society for its own sake, for seeding voluntary organizations to solve community problems. It's providing services to gain loyalty for political votes or loyalty, or to recruit members into your relatively secret society, if we're talking about the core of the MB. And therefore, they don't even want to call it civil society. They want to figure out another thing to call it, although in fact, it is a branch of civil society. Now, I think the problem today in Egypt is that we've gone so far in that demonization of what the Muslim Brotherhood did that you've got about a third to a half of the population being now called terrorists when they were simply sympathizers because their children had lights to study by at night and food on their tables. So we have to come back to some middle ground.
The only I probably know the least about this of everyone here, but I'll offer an observation really based on something Katie had, our question she asked about the role of universities in cultivating habits of civic engagement and among students. And my experience at Koç has been with the Koç University Social Impact Forum, which has sponsored my experiential philanthropy class, does seem to be cultivating these habits among students, which may then conflict with the very sort of with the cultural norms. And students are, my experience with a limited number of students is at times they're not really sure how to navigate that conflict or how to resolve it, I guess I should say. I mean, Ali would know more than I. In my class 2 years ago, the experiential philanthropy class, the students were gave their money to a Syrian refugee organization. I brought them to a Syrian refugee organization in the center of Istanbul, and these upper middle class students were really blown away by the experience of actually interacting with Syrian refugees. They wanted to make a difference. They really liked the idea, but they went to an LGBT organization. They went to a variety of organizations that would meet a Western definition of why we need these civil society organizations. They were intrigued by it. The university cultivates it, but I think they still then run into these social norms, these political norms that that run contrary to that. I mean, the one other observation I would make is in the earlier session, you referred to Denis Veneri, the organization, and the students said that all they knew about Denis Veneri and these institutions, but they didn't trust them. I don't know what the scandal was with Denis Veneri, but there's some way in which they took money, and all the students, even though they wanted to be very active in civil society, said, but we don't trust these organizations because we know, like Denis Veneri, they'll take our money and won't do anything with it.
I want to approach this from a perhaps a different angle. And one reason why donations in Turkey, for instance, has declined over the past decade is one reason that I couldn't talk during my presentation is we think due to the fact that governments' welfare expenditures also have been increasing, and the effectiveness of health and poverty alleviation programs during the tenure of the Justice and Development Party have significantly increased. That had an impact over private philanthropic initiatives, thinking that the state is already taking care of the problem. They need not spend their own resources. You would think, you would think that this would lead to different increased activity in different areas if given resources already there. That is not observed, to be honest with you. Another critical perspective that I should underline here, the name of the game in Turkish philanthropic sector, especially the Muslim philanthropic sector, during the tenure of the Justice and Development Party, has been to actually create a rent or a capture of the state resources. And if you have one sum of money in your pocket or in your group's network, and you not only spent that, but also you wanted to have influence over government projects. You want to have also doors open for the donors to your network. These are all criticisms voiced years before the recent developments against the Gülen movement. All right, philanthropic activism was there, but along the philanthropic activism, we also observed these businessmen from Kayseri and other Denizli and other smaller Anatolian towns trying to cut the dough for themselves in government tenders, for instance. Now the government clearly almost admits that, there was a capture of state authority in many lines of bureaucratic organizations. But the most important one is, I think, in the economic sphere. We're talking about banks, we're talking about companies. To what extent philanthropy and these private profit-driven activities are or were linked think is an important question that remains to be answered. I would underline that, we have schools, but we don't have hospitals. That tells you a lot, I think, about the motivations of philanthropic activism in Turkey. Schools are used for mobilizing generations that would serve you in the future, serve the community. But hospitals are a different kind of activity. You need help now, not tomorrow, or once you receive the help today, not necessarily you're going to be a better or more equipped person to serve in the future. You're just going to survive. And that survival focus, I'm afraid, is not there in the Turkish case, at least. In many other places, for instance, Indonesia, I know these organizations have hospitals.
has hospitals. They're all closed now.
Well, my hunch is that those hospitals, yes. I mean, my hunch is that hospitals is not what they're known for. You wouldn't go to a hospital, but you would consider, wow, these are good schools. I mean,
I'm mindful of the time.
Yes.
Do you want to add to?
Just before commenting, Scott, I like your comments on the adoption and adaptation of the by this organization, and also I don't know, it's a kind of the tension created by the state is a kind of quote unquote blessing to make this organization move on toward to get a network abroad, and also to move from zakat organization to become humanitarian organization. And I think your observation is correct. In terms of Indonesia, it is true that again, while within the country, state and civil society become in high tension, but in abroad they react differently. But this is the Indonesia case. It seemed to me there are many Southeast Asian countries. Malaysia will become differently because some NGOs from Malaysia told me that, well, you're lucky, Indonesian organization. When you work in maybe Bangladesh, Myanmar, Indonesian embassies help you a lot, but not us from Malaysia. Not even they hate that we are working outside our country. So it's, it will be like differences among Islamic philanthropy organizations. But Indonesia is quite a special case in this context.
Thank you very much for all the questions, and thank you for the wrap up and the great summary of the four papers. I just have one comment regarding the relationship between the state and the civil society. Maybe this wasn't deeply explored in my case, but I think the thing that makes it different is that okay, so for example, after the overthrow of Morsi in 2013, we have grassroots organizations called Jama'iyat Shar'iyya, which are very grassroots organizations that are directly related to the mosques that offer health and educational services. All of these organizations were shut down, and they exist across the country. And this happened because they were only associated with mosques, and at that time there was a crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood, and these organizations had a deep impact in the lives of those who live in very rural communities. and they were only shut down because of their relationships or their direct relation with the mosques, and they were taunted by terrorism as well as the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, this could be deeper and further researched. Thank you very much.
I know there are more questions out there, but I'm going to let you follow up individually with panelists because we have 10 minutes before the next session. So, thank you all. Please give a round of applause to our panelists.